Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Stephen Mithen. Stephen is professor of archaeology at the University of Reading and the author of a number of books on human prehistory, two of which include A Prehistory of the Mind and The Singing Neanderthals. He joins me today for a discussion of his most recent book called The Language Puzzle, a book about the evolution of human language. Dr. Stephen Mithen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
There's a concept in the book that's important to how and when human language evolved. I was hoping we could start by having you introduce the concept of fully modern language and why we see so much variation with fully modern language.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good starting point. You know, we all use language every day without thinking about it, but it is in fact a capacity that's quite difficult to define. I distinguish between fully modern language to make clear that there's previous stages of language that we could still call language because of communication systems, but they don't have all the attributes that we have today. So I guess by fully modern language, we're talking about a communication system that either uses sound and listening, as in speech, or can use signing and vision, as in sign language. But normally we think about it as speech, and so we'll stick to that. It's got two main components. One are words, and the majority of words have conventional meanings agreed by community. The symbols. So when I say dog, you know I'm meaning a four-legged animal with a tail that barks. That's a conventional meaning of it. And then the other aspect of language is grammar. Grammar has numerous syntax. It's the order in which words are put together, and is how we change the start and the ends of words to subtly change their meanings. So, you know, if I say a man bites dog, I mean something from dog bites man. It's got exactly the same symbols in, but the order of them is making a change. Now, fully modern language has those two elements, words and grammar. It's also got generally multiple word classes. There's content words, which are words for actions like running and seeing and hearing, and words for objects, nouns. These are things like table, dog, computer, and so forth. And then there's words that describe the qualities of those: black, white, big, smelly, noisy, the adjectives. So fully modern languages tend to have those three word classes. It's not universal, and equally some modern languages don't always use word order, but the majority of them do. Now, there's a huge number of languages in the world today, perhaps about 7,000, but even that is a tiny fraction of those that must have originally existed because they're going to extinct at a long rate. And each language has a particular set of words, the meanings of which are unique to that speech community, and a set of grammatical rules. Languages overlap, but they show this variation. And overall in the world today, there's a huge diversity of languages. They come into different language families, and that relates to their relatively recent evolution, because we think that at some time in the past, there was fully modern language spoken by just basically one community in the world. And as that community dispersed from Africa and spread out the world, and different populations became isolated from each other, their languages evolved in different directions and ended up with the multiple different languages we have today. Because language is something that's always changing, it's dynamic, it's constantly evolving. So I think they're the main qualities of fully modern language, and the ones that we need to try to understand, partly through evolution and partly through cultural change.
I was interested when you were talking about a place called Blombos Cave.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share a little of what makes this place special to the study of human prehistory and human evolution, and also some of your own experiences from visiting there, some of your impressions.
Okay, well, to reconstruct the evolution of language and why we have this remarkable capacity, and to fully understand its significance for human history and the present day, we have to look at the past, We have to go back before raw recorded time, and that takes us into the archaeological record. Now, all of archaeology is important, but there are a few particularly important archaeological sites, locations in the world that seem to hold quite special evidence. It's not that that's exactly where something evolved or happened, but it's where a human capacity, perhaps a new capacity, was expressed and allows archaeology access to them. One of those is Blombos Cave. It's on the coast of South Africa, and it dates from around 120,000 to about 40,000 years ago. But it's got really interesting archaeological horizons from about 100,000 to, say, 70,000 years ago. And they contain some of the very first evidence for the use of pigment for painting bodies, of crayons made out of ochre for marking probably on the walls of the cave and probably on bodies, for body decoration in terms of beads, for some very finely made tools, and for many stacked fireplaces showing that people were coming regularly back to this cave. It's a striking set of evidence because all of that was extremely rare in the period before that. And it seems to show that communities were changing now, beginning to use symbols, probably beginning to use language more effectively, I guess, for telling stories. The significance of the place is easy to describe in those terms, but the experience of the place is important because today it's on this beautiful coastline of South Africa. It's quite difficult to access. You climb up the cliffside, you enter the cave and you go down, and there in front of you is this fantastic stratigraphic section. All the layers of human deposits going through thousands of years, where you can see these layers of ash and charcoal and ochre. And it's really is quite an emotional experience because you're sitting there seeing the deposits made by probably some of the earliest people to use fully modern language. It's a truly wonderful place.
Sounds very moving and very interesting. Somewhat related to that, I'd like to ask you, when you were a young man, what inspirations led you to decide that you wanted to go into archaeology as a field and a career?
Well, I wouldn't say that happened to me. Well, I don't know when a young man begins really, but when I was at school, I hadn't really heard about archaeology much. It wasn't taught or come across my experience. I studied history and classics and so forth. But the thing I wanted to be was an artist. I wanted to be a painter and a sculptor, and I went to art college initially. That didn't work out. I left and I found myself working on a dig. And I thought this was really exciting, digging things up about the past and finding artifacts and traces of houses and fireplaces. And somebody told me, "Hey, Steve, you can study this at university." Wow, that never crossed my mind. So I went to university and studied it, and I've been studying archaeology ever since. But looking back, I think some of my early interest in art was about objects and artifacts, things with mysterious meanings that you've got to work out, like we do when you look at either abstract art or some sculptures that aren't necessarily figurative. So I think I did actually have a grounding in some of the key issues about archaeology from my original interests in art and environment and so forth. When I got to university, there was some really inspiring, I suppose, people, both the people who taught me and archaeologists from the past. I mean, I read a lot about the great archaeologist Vera Gordon-Childe, the Australian archaeologist who spent a lot of time as professors in UK and in Edinburgh and London. He was sort of the first to put some really big pictures about the human past, to try to draw lots of evidence together. He wrote some great books with titles today that would be a bit sniffy about, like Man Makes Himself. Obviously you wouldn't want to use that gender-specific thing today. But wow, this was amazing seeing the big picture of culture and human change through time. And then I gradually got more interested in the earlier phases of human past. There were people like Kenneth Oakley who'd written a wonderful book about stone tools. And that seemed to take us past You see, when you look at archaeology, if you start at the medieval period, you can only understand the medieval period by what's happening in the Roman period, and then that takes you back into the Iron Age and then the Bronze Age and everything. And I came to the view that if you want to understand what humanity is about, you really have to go into the deep human past, before the time of modern human origins, right back to the very first humans, because that's where some of our original abilities, capabilities evolved. That and the origins of farming, which was a major change in human life. So it was really during early time in university, from the experience of digging, early time in university, and becoming really intrigued by some fascinating archaeologists and their work.
You mentioned that we have to keep going back in time to see what came before it, to understand, what came next. I'd like to ask you to take us all the way back to the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees and bonobos.
Yeah.
How do we know the date of when this divergent evolution happened, or the rough date?
Yeah, we can only know approximately. I mean, broadly, this comes, it was one of the first outcomes of what we now recognize as the genomic revolution, because what we do, we compare the genomes of modern human, or the basic genome of modern human, and that of chimpanzees, and we look at how many differences there are in terms of mutations, genetic changes. And then if we have an estimate at the average rate at which those mutations occur, we can put a broad figure on how long it would have taken for these two species to diverge. So by looking at the number of changes in our genomes, with the estimated of how frequent they occur, we can put a date of something between 6 and 8 million years ago that we shared a common ancestor with the present day chimpanzee. And that broadly fits in with the fossil record, because as we look at the human past of our human ancestors, going back through the human genus, back to early modern humans, back to Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and then to the Australopithecines. Broadly, I don't like to say they're getting more chimpanzee-like, but we are sharing a greater degree of morphology in terms of brain size and the nature of the body and movement with chimpanzees today. So yeah, broadly between 6 and 8 million years ago, we shared a common ancestor with chimpanzee. And we sort of assumed that at that time, we had the similar capabilities that chimpanzees exhibit today. That might be a bit questionable assumption, because of course chimpanzees are modern species. They've evolved through time just like we've evolved through time. So there are some tricky issues to negotiate there.
As the Homo species went along in its evolution, it kept selecting for larger, more energy expensive brains. What are the trade-offs of this occurring over a long period of time, and how did it change the way human beings work and live and eat and reproduce?
Yeah, well, if we look at human evolution, we can see probably a fairly gradual enlargement of the brain through time. And of course, today we attribute our mental capacities, our use of language, our culture to basically having a fairly large brain. And that's of course that's right. But the modern brain size, I mean, that was present about 500,000 years ago, long before we saw much of the human culture that we attribute to our brain today, probably long before modern human language, certainly before farming or before complex technology. So it's not only having a large brain, it's the way all the billions of neurons within the brain are connected together. Those patterns of connectivity give us this particular type of intelligence. But also we should note that having a large brain has some drawbacks. And brain evolution was relatively slow, and may have had long periods of time, very slow, if not changing at all. And the drawbacks are essentially, well, there's several of them. Brains are really expensive energetic-wise. They take about 20% of our metabolic energy. So to have a large brain, you have to have a relatively rich diet in terms of protein and vitamins and minerals and so forth, and simply um, sufficient food to expend the energy on a large brain. And that means you've got to gather that food. Now, chimpanzees maintain a brain of about a quarter or a third of the size today, and that's partly what their diet allows. So to have that larger brain, you've not only got to be able to acquire that richer and large quantity of food, you've got to be able to digest it and consume it. So that's one particular challenge. And it looks like during evolution, there was a bit of a trade-off between having a larger brain and having to go to high quality foods that are easy and quicker to digest. That might have involved use of fire for cooking those foods, which make them more accessible. Another massive drawback is large brain and cranial size at birth. It makes it much more dangerous for women to give birth to children with a large brain size. And another trade-off, especially when we've developed bipedalism. Now, bipedalism, walking on two legs, is really effective for hunting and gathering, but it makes the pelvis much narrower. So it makes giving birth to babies with larger crania much more dangerous. And broadly, it led to a phase of infancy because the constraint required women to still give birth to babies with relatively small cranium. And then we have a long period of development when babies are pretty helpless and therefore become very susceptible to prey, and they have to need a lot of investment of time looking after them. So to get a large brain as an adult, you've got to invest a lot of looking after infants during childhood, and that makes a fundamental change in human society. The fact that we had to make all those payoffs shows the value of having a larger brain, which probably initially came from more effective communication, more effective planning, more complex thinking in many ways. But that gradually changed as there was new connections in the brain, coming from ongoing biological evolution, but also cultural evolution as well.
Related to this topic, you mentioned in the book two different kinds of traits. One is an ancestral trait and another is a derived trait.
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing what the difference between these two kinds of traits are, and how are scientists figuring out what trait belongs in which category?
Well, this is quite difficult, and it's quite an important issue. By ancestral traits, we mean ones that we inherit and we share with other species. So, for instance, we can talk about much of our ability of vision and color vision being an ancestral trait because we share that with chimpanzees. It's nothing specific to modern humans. Equally, we can talk about the bipedalism of modern humans, Homo sapiens, being an ancestral trait because we shared it with Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus that came before us. Derived traits are ones that are become unique in our particular lineage. So we can probably talk about fully modern language as a derived trait. It's something specific to Homo sapiens. It's not been inherited. So trying to separate the two is difficult. We often think that we have some derived traits, which later turn out to be ancestral. We now know that many chimpanzees have some word-like qualities in their vocalizations. So we see, perhaps we might say the origins of words is more of an ancestral trait shared with an ancestor rather than with derived. Similarly, we now know that chimpanzees, many of them are very effective tool makers, tool users. So that capability of manipulating probably organic plant materials first and then stones, that's probably also an ancestral trait rather than being derived.
You mentioned in the book that words are arbitrary and that this is a key design feature of language. Could you please share why this is a key design feature of language?
The majority of words in the language, like we're using today, they're arbitrary. By arbitrary, we mean that the sound they make, or if you're using sign language, the physical impression they make on you, the vision impression you, has nothing to do with a sensation we get from what they're referring to. So, for instance, if we talk about dog, a four-legged animal with a tail, it barks. In English, we call it a dog. In French, we call it chien. In German, we call it a Hund. Now, those sounds are completely different from each other. They're entirely arbitrary to what the dog looks, feels, sounds like. So they're arbitrary words. And the majority of the words in all languages are arbitrary. We could think of tree and table and boy and girl and so forth. Okay. Now, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this became believed to be a defining feature of language, that words are entirely arbitrary. And in a very famous book in the 1950s, it was described as one of the design features of language, that words are arbitrary. And it probably is one of the most important features. However, much earlier than that, and always there was a phase of research looking at words that aren't arbitrary. And these are called iconic words. Mm-hmm. These are words that capture a sound sensation or visual sensation of what we're referring to. And that you can probably guess the meaning of the word without any cultural association with the person speaking it. The classic ones are onomatopoeias like bang, crash, wallop, or we use them sometimes for animals like quack and oink and so forth. So many of these are imitating the animal or the event in the terms of the sound. They're not arbitrary words, they're iconic words. And equally, many of our iconic words have arbitrary words have some iconic elements to it. In English, and indeed the majority of language, small, tiny things are referred to with fairly small, tiny words using high front vowels, like in English, bee and ants and pea and so forth. The tiny thing. Big things often are using large back vowels like hippopotamus or enormous or elephant. So although those words are arbitrary, they have some iconic elements to them. So there's a grade between entirely arbitrary words, entirely iconic ones, and many in the middle that are referred to as hybrid words. So words are quite fluid in that regard. And early linguists, they really emphasized arbitrary words. And I think that provided a bit of a stumbling block for trying to understand the evolution of language for many years. Because how do you get from the sort of the barks and the grunts of chimpanzees and other animals to arbitrary words? Well, it's extremely difficult, but iconic words can act as a bit of a bridge between them, which is, of course, a key argument that not only I make in my book, but it's been made by other anthropologists, academics, and indeed going right back to the Enlightenment, people are making that argument. But I've tried to put it into a modern framework.
Yeah, I really liked this chapter in the book because it wasn't just Dr. Mithen, the scientist, but also the historian as well. You went right back to ancient times and talked about how they were looking at iconic words, and some of the most recent studies are also looking at them. Could you say a little bit more about this? Because I got the sense that you enjoyed this study.
Yeah, I do greatly. It's a great mistake of us to think that all progress on these big questions, like whether it's evolution of language or how the brain works, is only coming from the application of modern day science. Better brain scanners, more detailed analysis of genes and so forth. And sometimes we forget the great insights by some of the earliest writers on these subjects. Language is a classic case on that. Probably some of the first writing on language came from Plato, writing in 5th century BC. He had this fantastic dialogue that he wrote called the Cratylus, in which Socrates discusses with others about how did things get their names. And in fact, the whole idea of iconic words was first brought up. And then it was because Socrates was talking about how we say for words that are of round objects, we roll our tongue around our mouth. We almost mimic the object by using how we move our jaws and our tongue and so forth. And this was really picked up in the Enlightenment. Gottfried Herder, a great Enlightenment writer, he tried to solve the issue of language. They never managed it because they're always partly tied up by this big barrier between animals and humans and rationality. But nevertheless, Herder particularly wrote about sense impressions and how these are sort of captured in vocalizations. Now, I had some knowledge of all that writing, but then remarkably, in the last 10 years, many linguists are paying a bit of lip service to that early writing and thought. They were doing lots of research on iconic words and how these are really key to how children learn language. We talked a moment ago how our language is dominated by arbitrary words. Well, young children, their language is dominated by iconic words. And they were doing a huge number of experimental work on children language learning, showing that iconic words are really key to them learning about how words are used and their early stages of learning language. Well, that was a remarkable then connection between what they were doing and what had been said by these Enlightenment writers and even classical writers. And what I tried to do in my book was to make a bridge between those. I was saying, wow, this is so fascinating. We need to acknowledge those early writers, the contribution made. That sort of got forgotten for, several hundred years. And now with this new research, we can realize their insights in the past. And we've got to give them credit. And that also gives, I think, authority to the work that linguists and psychologists have been doing in recent years. It's a lovely combination. And I did indeed, as you say, enjoy writing about that, and was really inspired by the struggles of people like Herd and Rousseau to try to understand language. They were really great people, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have a son who's 13 months old, and almost on a daily basis right now, we're impressed and amazed by how he's understanding more and more language.
Yeah.
He's not speaking much language yet, but words like hat and park and bird and all these kinds of words, he's learning more and more every day. It just seems to be picking them up. How do children drive their own language learning and pick up the meaning of words so quickly?
Yeah, well, this is another absolutely fascinating topics. I mean, there's various ways. But obviously, babies come into this world. They already have some sense of language that's come from when they're in the mother's womb. They hear the vibrations of spoken language. They pick up the rhythms of the language that their speech community uses, that their mother and their family uses. But they have no idea about language. They have no knowledge of words. What they're able to do, though, is very rapidly process the sounds they hear. And they have this amazing ability to identify recurrent sound strings in the continuous set of sounds they hear. Because, when we have language, we tend to think that we speak in discrete words with little gaps between. We don't. It's a continuous stream of sound. And what babies have a brilliant ability to do is segment that into small fractions and understand which fractions are words and how those words are associated with particular objects. It's an amazing statistical learning process. Now, we help them by that. As parents, as caregivers, we help them by that, by the way we talk to them. Because I'm sure as you talk to your child and baby, even when newborn, we use what's often termed rather technically infant-directed speech. It's often called motherese, where we sort of exaggerate the vowels, we heighten them, we slow our language, and what we're doing, we're emphasizing particular words, the stops of phrases at the starts of other ones, and we help infants acquire that language by how we speak to them. And we often also do that by using lots more iconic words in our speak. We often we exaggerate the contours of our language and the sounds we use to match the objects that we're referring to. And we also use a lot of musicality in our speech. We know that infants are really sensitive to musicality. They're sort of born into the world as born musicians, and I think that relates to sort of an early evolution stage, even before language, when musicality was really important. So we emphasize the pitch and the rhythm of sounds, and babies are particularly sensitive to that. So it's a combination of us scaffolding their learning, but also infants having a remarkable learning ability. And at some stage, they gain the concept of words. And once they've gained that concept, they have a thirst for knowledge, for acquiring more and more words. And as you've experienced, their ability to learn words is just astonishing. They're learning 9, 10 every day, and we continue that right into adolescence. So we end up with vocabularies of perhaps 60 or 70,000 words each that we can draw upon. It's an amazing, almost miraculous feat that our brains allow us to do.
I just remembered another question about the archaeological record that I wanted to ask you. And this was a new term for me. It was something you called the missing majority. And it's about the types of tools that we think our ancestors used, but they haven't survived the archaeological record.
Yeah.
Could you say a little about what this is?
Yeah.
If anything at all survives.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, really important. We talk about the Stone Age, and we use that as a synonym for the ancient past, because for between 2.5 million years up until 100,000 years ago, say, the vast majority of our archaeological evidence is of stone tools. The initially cobble tools that our ancestors used for breaking open bones and pounding plants. Eventually, things like spear points and knives, scrapers. And archaeologists have spent, generations trying to understand how these tools were made, and particularly what type of cognitive abilities and language abilities were required to make them and pass them on from generation to generation. And that's critically important work. Now, the problem with this is that was another huge class of tools that we believe had been used, but just have not survived in our record, or very rarely survived. And these are the ones mainly made from plant material. These would have been bits of plant fibers, plants' leaves, sticks, and all of these can be used for quite complex tasks. You can use a stick as a digging stick for digging up tubers from the ground. You can use it as a throwing stick for hunting. You could use plants and skins as a baby sling for carrying babies, for making bags. And if we look at recently documented hunter-gatherers, we see that for some of them, especially in the African environment similar to ancestors, the toolkits could have been dominated by these types of raw materials, but unfortunately none of them survived. And moreover, making those types of tools would have used qualities, abilities different to those of making stone tools. So to make a basket, you may have had to make thread from plant fibers, then twist those together, tie knots and so forth. These are all quite complex cognitive tasks that may have been employed long before we were flaking stone. Now, because those tools don't survive anymore, we can only partly guess that they're there, but very occasionally we find some examples of those. One of the great finds was long wooden spears found at Schöningen in Germany dating to about 350,000 years ago. These are beautiful long javelins made by Neanderthals, showed that they had huge skills at making these spears, finely balanced, very carefully smooth, lots of different phases of making. And then occasionally we find little bits of twisted fiber that have preserved in unique conditions. So that's probably the missing majority of the toolkits that we don't have. And I worry that by focusing on stone tools, we underestimate the cognitive abilities and probably linguistic abilities of our earliest ancestors. There has, in fact, just been a brilliant book published by an American anthropologist called Dean Falk, which is called The Botanic Age. And she's arguing that before stone tools, we should recognize the Botanic Age when tools were mainly made from plant materials, and they were used for all of these tasks that I've been describing about. So we do need to acknowledge those. And it's a frustration by archaeologists that we rarely get access to them. But that's the nature of the task, and all sciences have missing data, and that's a particular one that we're missing. When we get into later periods of prehistory, we start getting these organic tools preserved, because at smaller periods of time, they get preserved, notably when they're waterlogged. So especially when we get to the Neolithic and people start farming, we get lots of these organic tools preserved, and they give a brilliant insight into human daily activities and long-term culture change.
I have a couple more questions I would like to ask you. One of them is related to, but maybe slightly outside of what we're talking about today. Next year will be, if I'm not mistaken, the 30-year anniversary of The Prehistory of the Mind, a book you published back in the 1990s. Yeah. Is there anything planned for this 30-year occasion?
I haven't got anything planned. I don't think anybody has it planned. It's it's just scary to me that I think it's 30 years since I wrote that book. It is a book that's had, I think, quite a big impact, and one that I continually go back and draw on. People still read. It was the first one that to try to put together, as I do in the language puzzle, evidence from different disciplines. Archaeologists have previously written about the evolution of human intelligence and the mind, but they'd only drawn on archaeology. That seemed a bit ridiculous to me. So what I tried to do in the Prehistory of the Mind, I tried to look at what was the current research in neuroscience at the time? What was the research in the philosophy of mind at the time? And I put them together to make a proposition for the Prehistory of the Mind, and especially looking at the differences between Neanderthals and modern human cognition. And the key arguments I made in that the Neanderthals had what I call a bit of a domain-specific mentality. They were very intelligent, very clever in different domains of activity, like manipulating material objects or knowing about the natural world or living in the social world or thinking about it. But they had difficulty bringing these together, and argued that lack of that was really metaphor, their inability to use metaphor. What I avoided in the Prehistory of the Mind was to write about language. I did that because there had been lots of books in the early 1990s about the evolution of language, and I felt that they were really neglecting other areas of human cognitive ability, like, coming up with creative ideas. So the Prehistory of the Mind was about the evolution of the mind, making just not really attacking language so much. And it really took me almost 30 years to feel confident to write about language, which I did in the language puzzle. I'm still going back to ideas in the Prehistory of the Mind. The last chapter was all about the origins of agriculture, and I'm writing a new book at the moment about the origins of agriculture and long-term development of farming that I think is as important as the evolution of language in terms of creating the modern human condition. It would be nice to have an anniversary edition of the Prehistory of the Mind. I agree with that, but I don't have the capability at the moment.
But the one that you're working on sounds interesting as well, so I look forward to reading that when it's available. And you slightly touched on the last question that I want to ask you. I like asking authors to talk about the title and subtitles of their book and how they come up with them and what they're expressing by choosing this title. And in the case with the language puzzle, perhaps we could tie the answer into one of the other important pieces of this story, which is how we use metaphor.
Yeah, sure. Titles of books are difficult, really difficult. In my experience, I tend to write quite academic titles, whereas publishers want much more popular titles. And I had long pushback, especially with the American publishers, where they wanted some what I thought was rather cheesy titles for the book. But the language puzzle is an honest title because language is a puzzle. We use it every day. We use it unthinkingly. We use it for almost everything we do. We use it for communicating and thinking. It's a puzzle how it came about and how we managed to do that. In fact, there's so many puzzles about language. And I thought in the language puzzle, to answer those questions, we can't just rely on linguistics. Linguistics is only going to have part of the answers because linguistics doesn't look at the deep human past. Linguistics don't look at the operation of the brain. We need to look at how the brain operates. We need to look at the human evolutionary past. We need to look at the evidence from archaeology. We need to look at the evidence of how children acquire language. We need to look at the evidence of how language has changed through time in modern society. So it seemed to me that each of those different academic disciplines, which our universities unfortunately separate into different departments, and each have their own different journals and traditions and so forth. But each of those different disciplines have a bit of the evidence, part of the theories, part of the ideas that we need to somehow piece together to get an overview of what language is, how we are able to use it, and how it evolved. So it seemed to me that to answer language is like putting pieces of a puzzle together. No discipline can have all the answers. And some of the answers that some disciplines think they have are just not going to fit in with those from other disciplines. So it's a bit like putting the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. And that's really acted as a metaphor for my book, because each of the chapters are primarily about one aspect of language, whether it's iconic words or children acquiring language or the evolutionary past or the role of symbols and when they evolved. And in the final chapter of the book, I tried to put all those pieces together to come up with some scenario. And if you think of it as a jigsaw, if you can do that successfully, you'll get a picture gradually emerging, which will still have gaps in. There'll be still missing pieces of new research that we need to do. And I liked using that metaphor in the book because a key argument of the book is that a distinguishing feature of modern human language compared to the types of language that our immediate ancestors used, like, say, the Neanderthals, or, say, Homo heidelbergensis, which had brains as large as us, which must have been using a fairly sophisticated form of language, is that we use metaphor very frequently in our language and our thinking. And as we do that, it gave language a whole new capability. It gave our possibility to use language as a method of thought a whole new possibility, and took us into new domains of cognition that really have shaped the modern world, such as language and religion and so forth. I don't think Neanderthals had ability to use metaphor. If I said to a Neanderthal, my son is a lion, or my daughter, she's like a fox, or my baby is just a flower, they would have no idea what I'm talking about, because These are totally separate domains, but by bringing them together, we can express something succinctly that just other words wouldn't be able to capture. And metaphor then sits at the basis of science. Some of the great, to understand concepts in science, we tend to use metaphors from the everyday world. The soul is the atom is like a series of circulating, like a bit like a solar system, or cells were identified and they're compared to the cells of little rooms and things like that. These give us a ways of understanding really difficult, complex concepts and abstract words by building up from our everyday experience by using metaphors. And I think there's that which has really driven human society, cognition, and culture over the last 100,000 years. So it was that ability to use metaphors by particular connections in the brain that emerged around 150,000 years ago that took the building blocks of language, enabled us to use metaphors to think differently and newly and start a whole new phase of cultural development. So I tried to capture in that book by using a metaphor through the book to say that actually metaphor's the most important thing to do. Because I think if I wasn't using that metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle, I wouldn't have been able to write the book. It would have been so difficult to write it, and I hope it helps people read it and understand it.
Yeah, I thought it was very helpful. And I say this in a positive way. It's I found it to be a challenging topic, but one I really enjoyed reading. And like we were saying about the prehistory of the mind just a minute ago, I think this is a book that I'll be able to consult, for decades to come and keep coming back to it because there's so much here. And
yeah. I used a metaphor of the prehistory of the mind as well to try and explain it when I was talking about the evolution of the mind as a bit like a little religious building starting as a small church with tiny windows and then having lots of separate chapels and then eventually becoming opened out like a large Gothic cathedral, really. And I felt again that helped me understand it and gave a reader something to hook onto from their everyday experience to try to understand these rather difficult concepts.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading this book, and I thought it was a great pleasure to have the chance to speak with you. Thanks very much for your time and for joining me for this conversation.
Well, thank you. It's been great talking about the language puzzle and these issues generally. And thanks very much for inviting me onto your podcast.